The gunshot echoed across Blackridge Hollow just as the sun bled into the horizon, a single crack that shattered the uneasy quiet of a town built on secrets and judgment. Mara Ellison stood on the dusty platform, her hand trembling inside her coat pocket, staring down a man who'd come to drag her back to a life she'd nearly died escaping. Beside her, Caleb Vance, a rancher carved from silence and stone, didn't flinch. The entire town watched, breath held, wondering if these two strangers would survive the night, let alone build a life together. If you want to see how this story ends, stay with me until the very last word. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind came sharp across the plains that autumn, carrying dust and the smell of coming winter. Blackridge Hollow sat at the edge of civilization like a scar on the landscape, a place where people came to disappear or to claw their way back from disappearing. The town wasn't cruel by nature, but it was unforgiving, and it remembered everything. Caleb Vance had lived there for 23 years, and in all that time he'd spoken fewer words than most men spoke in a single drunken evening. He was 50 years old, tall and lean, with shoulders that had carried too much for too long. His face was weathered like old leather, and his eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, held the kind of quiet that made people nervous. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a man who'd learned that words rarely fixed what was broken. He owned 300 acres of unforgiving land west of town, ran cattle when the seasons allowed, and kept to himself with a discipline that bordered on religion. People respected him. Some feared him. But no one really knew him, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The ranch house sat alone against the horizon, a two-story structure built from timber and necessity. Inside it was clean but sparse, functional furniture, no photographs, no trinkets. The only luxury Caleb allowed himself was a shelf of books in the front room, mostly histories and almanacs, their spines cracked from reading. He read every night before bed, not for pleasure, but because the silence in his head was sometimes worse than the silence around him. He'd been married once, a lifetime ago. Her name had been Elizabeth, and she'd died in childbirth along with their son. 22 years had passed since then, and Caleb had never so much as looked at another woman with intention. The grief had calcified inside him, turning into something harder than bone, and he'd built his entire life around the architecture of that hardness. But lately, and he couldn't say exactly when it had started, the silence had begun to feel less like protection and more like prison. He was 50 years old, and the ranch that had once felt like purpose now felt like penance. He woke before dawn, worked until his body ached, ate alone, slept alone, and woke again to do it all over. The cycle was endless, and for the first time in 2 decades, Caleb began to wonder if he was already dead and just didn't have the sense to lie down. It was Thomas Garrett, the town's banker and one of the few men Caleb spoke to with any regularity, who first suggested the idea. They were standing in Garrett's office on a Tuesday afternoon, Caleb having come to settle accounts on a land payment. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and sunlight slanted through the window and dusty bars. "You ever think about marrying again?" Garrett asked, casual as commenting on the weather. Caleb looked at him, expressionless. "No." "Well, maybe you should." Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb with the careful gaze of a man who'd learned to read people through their debts. "You're not a young man anymore, Caleb. Ranch like yours needs more than one pair of hands, and a house that quiet." He trailed off, shaking his head. "That's no way to live." "I manage fine." "Managing isn't living." Garrett pulled open a drawer and withdrew a newspaper, folded to a specific page. "You heard of these matrimonial agencies? Women back east, widows mostly, looking for a fresh start. Practical arrangements. No illusions, no romance. Just two people who need something from each other." Caleb stared at the paper like it might bite him. "That's not for me." "Why not? You too proud to admit you're lonely?" The word hit harder than Caleb expected. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not lonely. I'm fine." "Then why do you look like a man waiting to die?" Caleb didn't answer. He left the office without another word, but the newspaper stayed in his thoughts like a splinter under skin. For 3 weeks, he ignored it. He worked harder, pushed himself further, tried to exhaust the idea out of his system. But late at night, when the house creaked with emptiness and the wind howled like something wounded, the thought returned. Not the romantic notion of companionship. Caleb had buried that with Elizabeth. But the simple, practical truth. He was tired. Tired of silence. Tired of solitude. Tired of waking up every morning to a life that felt like slow suffocation. Finally, on a cold November evening, Caleb sat down at his kitchen table with a pen and paper. His hand shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the unfamiliarity of what he was about to do. He'd written contracts, signed land deeds, corresponded with cattle buyers. But this was different. This was asking for something. He kept it simple, almost businesslike. Rancher 50 seeks capable woman for partnership. Ranch work required. Honest and hardworking. No false promises. Reply if interested. He read it 3 times, each time feeling more foolish. Then he folded it, sealed it, and before he could change his mind, rode into town and posted it to the matrimonial agency Thomas had mentioned. For 2 months, nothing came. Caleb told himself he was relieved. He went back to his routines, his silences, his well-worn paths. But something had shifted. He'd cracked open a door he couldn't quite close again. Then, in early January, a letter arrived. 300 miles east, in the industrial sprawl of Providence, Mara Ellison sat in a boarding house room barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. She was 45 years old, and every one of those years had left its mark. Not in her face, which was still handsome in a stern, angular way, but in her hands, rough and scarred from work, and in her eyes, which carried the weight of choices made and survived. She'd been married twice, the first time to a man who'd drunk himself to death before 30, leaving her with debts and bruises that took years to fade. The second time to a factory foreman who'd seemed stable until the day he wasn't. And then Mara had found herself on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination never to be that helpless again. For 12 years, she'd worked in textile mills, laundries, and kitchens. Any job that paid and didn't ask questions. She'd saved what she could, kept her head down, and built a life that was small, but hers. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Until it wasn't. The mill had closed in October, taking with it not just Mara's job, but the jobs of 300 women like her. The city, already overcrowded and indifferent, had no place for middle-aged women with no connections and no skills beyond hard labor. Within weeks, Mara's savings dwindled to almost nothing. The boarding house landlady, a woman with a heart like a cash register, gave her until the end of the month to pay or get out. Mara had survived worse. She told herself that every morning, but sitting in that cramped room, listening to the sounds of the city, the rattle of carriages, the shouts of vendors, the endless grinding noise of too many people pressed too close together, she realized she couldn't do this anymore. She was 45 years old, and she was tired. Not the physical tiredness that came from a long day's work, but the bone-deep exhaustion of a life spent fighting just to stay standing. She needed a way out, not an escape. Mara had learned long ago that there was no such thing, but a different battlefield, a place where hard work still meant something, where silence wasn't just the prelude to violence, where she could build something that couldn't be taken away by bad luck or worse men. That's when she saw the advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette. It was tucked between flowery proposals from lonely widowers and earnest declarations from young men seeking companionship and affection. Caleb Vance's notice stood out precisely because it promised nothing. Rancher 50 seeks capable woman for partnership. Ranch work required. Honest and hardworking. No false promises. Mara read it 5 times. Then she sat down and wrote her reply. She didn't lie. She told him her age, her circumstances, her lack of dowry or refinement. She told him she'd been married before and that both marriages had ended badly. She told him she had no illusions about romance or love, but she knew how to work, how to manage a household, and how to survive things that would have broken softer women. "I'm not looking for rescue," she wrote. "I'm looking for partnership. If that's what you're offering, I'm interested." She posted the letter before she could second-guess herself, and then she waited. The reply came 3 weeks later. It was even shorter than his original advertisement. Practical arrangement, no false expectations. If you can handle frontier life, I can provide stability. Arrive by February if you're serious. No poetry, no promises. Not even his name signed in full. Just C. Vance, Blackridge Hollow. Mara sat with that letter for 2 days. She knew what she was risking. Moving west to marry a stranger was the kind of decision desperate women made, and not all of them survived it. She'd heard stories. Women who arrived to find their husbands were liars, drunks, or worse. Women who disappeared into the wilderness and were never heard from again. But she'd also heard stories of women who'd found something they never would have found in the crowded, suffocating cities back east. Freedom, space, a chance to build something real. And Mara Ellison had never been afraid of risk, only of staying still. She wrote back, "I'll be there." The journey west took 12 days by train and another half day by stagecoach. Mara traveled light, one trunk containing everything she owned, which wasn't much. Practical clothes, sturdy boots, a few personal items that had survived 2 marriages and a dozen moves. She kept the matrimonial letters in her coat pocket, reading them during the long stretches of empty prairie when doubt crept in. The land changed as they moved west. The crowded industrial sprawl gave way to farmland, then open plains, then the raw, unfinished country where towns appeared like accidents and disappeared just as quickly. Mara watched it all through the train window, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not hope. She was too practical for that, but possibility. Blackridge Hollow appeared on the horizon just before sunset on a Tuesday in late February. It wasn't much. A single main street lined with rough-hewn buildings, a church steeple rising like an accusation, and beyond that, the endless sweep of empty land. The wind hit Mara the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, cold and sharp enough to cut. The driver dropped her trunk in the dust and pointed toward a man standing near the edge of the platform. "That'll be Vance." Mara turned, and for the first time she saw the man she'd agreed to marry. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate little. His face was weathered and unreadable, his eyes pale gray and fixed on her with an intensity that wasn't quite hostile but wasn't warm either. He wore work clothes, denim and leather, both faded from sun and use, and stood with the kind of stillness that suggested he was comfortable being exactly where he was, even if everyone else wasn't. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Mara felt the weight of every eye in town on them, curious, judgmental, already making up stories about who she was and why she'd come. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was the way Caleb looked at her, direct, assessing, but without the leering calculation she'd learned to recognize in men's eyes. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, rough from disuse. "You're Mara Ellison." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I am." He nodded once, then picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing. "Stage is late. We'll lose the light before we get back." That was it. No greeting, no welcome, no acknowledgement that they were about to embark on one of the strangest arrangements 2 people could make. Just practicality. Mara found herself almost smiling. Then we should go. The wagon was basic, functional boards and wheels, a single bench seat. Caleb loaded her trunk into the back and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, his grip firm but not aggressive. Mara climbed up, arranged her skirts, and settled in for the ride. They drove in silence. The road, such as it was, cut through open country, the kind of vast emptiness Mara had never experienced before. In the city, you were never alone. Here, you could see for miles in every direction and not encounter another soul. It should have felt lonely, but instead it felt clean, uncluttered. "Your letters said you'd been married before," Caleb said suddenly, his eyes still on the road. "Twice," Mara confirmed. "Both times ended badly." "How badly?" She appreciated the directness. "First husband drank himself to death. Second one had a temper and fist to match. I left before it killed me." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then, "I was married once. She died young. That was a long time ago." "Any children?" "Stillborn son, same night." The words were delivered without emotion, but Mara heard the weight beneath them. She knew grief when she heard it. "I'm sorry. It was 22 years ago." "Grief doesn't care how long it's been." He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time something flickered in those pale eyes. Not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement. "No," he said. it doesn't. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. By the time the ranch house came into view, a solid structure against the darkening sky, full night had fallen. Caleb drove the wagon right up to the porch, set the brake, and climbed down. "I'll show you inside," he said, lifting her trunk. "You'll have the upstairs bedroom. I sleep downstairs." Mara followed him up the porch steps and through the front door. The interior was exactly what she'd expected: clean, sparse, functional. No warmth, but no squalor either. It was the home of a man who took care of what was his but didn't waste energy on comfort. Caleb carried her trunk up the narrow staircase and set it down in a small bedroom. The room held a bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the dark plains. Nothing more. "There's water in the pitcher," Caleb said. "Outhouse is out back. I rise at 5, usually eat around 6. Kitchen's downstairs if you're hungry now." Mara looked around the room, then back at him. "This is fine, thank you." He nodded. "We'll talk terms in the morning. Get some rest." He turned to leave, but Mara stopped him. "Caleb," he paused in the doorway. "I meant what I said in my letters. I'm not here for romance or rescue. I'm here to build something. If you can honor that, we'll get along fine." For the first time since she'd arrived, something almost like a smile crossed his face. "I can honor that." He left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and Mara was alone. She stood in the small room, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the wind outside, the vast silence of the frontier pressing against the walls. It was nothing like the boarding house in Providence, nothing like any place she'd ever lived. But for the first time in years, Mara Ellison felt something she'd almost forgotten. The possibility that she might actually survive this. More than survive. Maybe even build something that mattered. She unpacked her few belongings, washed her face in the cold water, and lay down on the narrow bed. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was deep and dreamless. Morning arrived cold and pale. Mara woke to the sound of movement downstairs, boots on wood, the clank of a stove being stoked. She dressed quickly in practical clothes and made her way down to the kitchen. Caleb was already there, brewing coffee and frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. He glanced up when she entered but didn't speak until the coffee was ready. He poured 2 cups, handed her one, and gestured to the table. "Sit." Mara sat. The coffee was strong and black, exactly how she liked it. Caleb joined her, setting a plate of eggs and bread between them. "We should talk about how this is going to work." "All right." He took a sip of coffee, organizing his thoughts. "I'm not a man who speaks much. I don't like wasted words or wasted time. If you need something, ask. Don't expect me to guess." "Fair enough. Same goes for you." He nodded. "Ranch work is hard. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There's cattle to tend, fences to mend, feed to manage. Winter's ending, which means calving season soon. It's going to be long days and little rest. I've worked hard before. City work isn't the same as ranch work. Then teach me." He studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes searching for something. Finally, "All right, we'll start today. I'll show you the land, introduce you to the work. You can decide if you're still interested in marrying me after you've seen what the life actually is." Mara met his gaze steadily. "I've already decided. I'm not someone who changes her mind easily." "We'll see." They ate in silence, and then Caleb stood. "Dress warm. It's cold out." The next 3 hours were a baptism by ice and wind. Caleb walked Mara across the entire ranch, pointing out landmarks, explaining the layout of pastures and water sources, showing her the barn and the equipment shed. He spoke more in those 3 hours than Mara suspected he'd spoken in the previous 3 months. But every word was necessary, practical. She listened carefully, asked questions when she didn't understand, and kept pace with his long strides even when her legs ached from the uneven ground. By the time they returned to the house, her cheeks were raw from wind and her hands were numb, but she'd learned the basic geography of her new life. Caleb watched her stamp snow from her boots on the porch. "You did well." It was the closest thing to praise she'd heard from him, and Mara found herself oddly pleased. "I told you I could work." "Working is one thing, lasting is another." "I'll last." He almost smiled again. "Come inside, you'll catch cold." That became their pattern over the next week. Every morning, Caleb would teach her something new: how to recognize a sick cow, how to repair barbed wire, how to manage the temperamental wood stove. Mara absorbed it all with the same fierce determination she'd brought to every other challenge in her life. She made mistakes, of course, but she learned from them and didn't make the same one twice. In the evenings, they'd eat together at the kitchen table, talking in short, practical exchanges about the day's work and the next day's plans. It wasn't companionship in any traditional sense, but it was something: two people learning to occupy the same space without friction. But Blackridge Hollow was watching. Mara felt it every time they went into town for supplies. Eyes followed them, conversations stopped when they approached, and the silence that trailed in their wake was thick with judgment. The town had already made up its mind about her. She was a desperate woman who'd come west to trap a lonely man, a fortune hunter, an opportunist. Never mind that Caleb had no fortune to hunt. Never mind that Mara had asked for nothing beyond honest work and a fair partnership. The story the town wanted to tell was already written, and Mara's actual presence was just an inconvenient detail. "They're talking about us," she said one evening as they drove back from town. Caleb didn't look at her. "They always talk." "Does it bother you?" "No." "It should. They think I'm taking advantage of you." "Let them think what they want. I know the truth." Mara studied his profile in the fading light. "And what's the truth?" He was quiet for a long moment, then, "That we're both too old and too tired to care what this town thinks. We made an arrangement. We're both honoring it. That's all that matters." Mara felt something loosen in her chest. "You're right. I usually am." This time, she did smile. "Don't get cocky, Vance." "Wouldn't dream of it." The wedding was set for 3 weeks away, enough time for the banns to be posted and for Mara to prove to herself and to Caleb that she could handle the life she'd signed up for. They didn't talk about it much. It hung in the future like a practical checkpoint rather than a romantic milestone. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Not love. Neither of them was foolish enough to expect that. But respect, trust, the kind of quiet partnership that came from two people pulling in the same direction. Mara learned that Caleb's silence wasn't coldness but self-protection. He'd been hurt deeply, lost everything that mattered, and built walls so high that even he couldn't see over them anymore. But he was fair, honest, and beneath the granite exterior, there was a decency that Mara hadn't encountered in any of the men she'd known before. Caleb, in turn, discovered that Mara was nothing like the desperate, scheming woman the town whispered about. She was strong, capable, and fiercely independent. She didn't ask for help unless she needed it, didn't complain about the hard work, and brought a practical intelligence to every task. More than that, she understood silence. She didn't try to fill every quiet moment with chatter or force intimacy where none existed. She let him be, and that was a gift he hadn't known he needed. 2 weeks before the wedding, they were working together in the barn, sorting through winter feed stores, when Mara spoke suddenly. "Why did you really write that advertisement?" Caleb paused, pitchfork in hand. "I told you, the ranch needed help. You could have hired a hand. Hands leave. And wives don't?" He set down the pitchfork and looked at her directly. "You want the truth?" "Always." "I was tired of being alone, not lonely, alone. There's a difference." Mara nodded slowly. "I understand that." "Do you?" "Yes. Loneliness is wanting someone. Being alone is just existing in a space no one else occupies. It's emptier." "Exactly." He picked up the pitchfork again. "What about you? Why did you really answer?" "I told you. I needed a fresh start." "There are other ways to start fresh." Mara was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, "I spent my entire life fighting just to survive. I wanted to fight for something instead, build something. This seemed like the best chance I'd get. And now that you're here?" She met his eyes. "I'm not disappointed." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that whatever they were building, it was real. Not romantic, perhaps, but real nonetheless. "Neither am I," Caleb said quietly. That night, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the empty plains, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, exactly, but contentment. The sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. Beside her, Caleb sat in his customary silence, smoking his pipe and watching the horizon. After a while, he spoke without looking at her. Town's going to make this difficult. I know. They're already talking. It'll get worse. I can handle talk. It's not just talk I'm worried about. He turned to face her. Some people in this town have long memories and short tempers. They don't like outsiders, and they don't like change. You showing up, us getting married, that's both. Mara absorbed this calmly. Are you trying to scare me off? No, I'm trying to prepare you. Then consider me prepared. I didn't come all this way to run at the first sign of trouble. Caleb studied her in the fading light, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something like pride in his expression. No, he said. I don't suppose you did. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, two people on the edge of something neither fully understood but both were willing to face together. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and whatever came after, judgment, hostility, hardship, they would meet it the same way they'd met everything else, with honesty, hard work, and a partnership built not on illusion, but on the simple, radical decision to stand together against whatever the world threw at them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The town would continue to whisper, to judge, to wait for them to fail. But tonight, sitting on that porch under a sky full of stars, Mara Ellison and Caleb Vance allowed themselves something rare, the quiet certainty that they'd made the right choice. The morning of their first trip into town, as an engaged couple, dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the plains like a warning. Mara dressed carefully, choosing her most practical outfit, a simple dark dress with a wool coat, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She'd learned long ago that in places like Blackridge Hollow, a woman was judged not by how she presented herself, but by what the town had already decided she was. Caleb was waiting by the wagon, checking the harness with methodical precision. He glanced up when she approached, his eyes taking in her appearance with a single sweep. You ready for this? He asked. Are you asking if I'm afraid of small-town gossip? I'm asking if you understand what you're walking into. Mara climbed onto the wagon seat without waiting for his help. I've survived worse than judgment, Caleb. I'll survive this too. He made a sound that might have been approval and climbed up beside her. The ride into town took 40 minutes, following the rutted road that cut through open country. They passed 2 other ranches along the way. Both times, Mara saw curtains twitch in windows, saw faces appear and disappear. The news of Caleb Vance's bride-to-be had clearly spread faster than wildfire. Blackridge Hollow looked even smaller in daylight than it had when Mara first arrived. The main street consisted of perhaps 20 buildings: the general store, a saloon, the bank, a blacksmith, the marshal's office, and a scattering of other establishments that serviced the surrounding ranches and farms. At the far end stood the church, its white paint peeling, its steeple pointing toward heaven like an accusation. Caleb guided the wagon to a stop in front of Henderson's general store. Before they'd even climbed down, Mara felt eyes on them. Not subtle glances, but open stares. 3 women standing outside the dressmaker's shop had stopped their conversation mid-sentence to watch. 2 men loitering near the saloon straightened up, their expressions hard and curious. Let them look, Caleb said quietly, offering his hand to help her down. Eyes won't kill you. No, Mara agreed, taking his hand. But they'll try to make you wish you were dead. Inside the general store, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and a face like weathered granite, stood behind the counter arranging bolts of fabric. She looked up when they entered, her expression shifting from polite shopkeeper neutrality to something considerably colder. Mr. Vance, she said, her tone clipped. Didn't expect to see you today. Need supplies, Caleb replied, his voice as flat and unreadable as always. This is Mara Ellison, my fiancée. The word hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Henderson's eyes raked over Mara with the kind of assessment women gave each other when measuring threats or competition. Mara had been on the receiving end of that look more times than she could count. She held the older woman's gaze steadily, refusing to flinch or look away. "Miss Ellison," Mrs. Henderson said finally, the title pointed and deliberate, ignoring the fact that Mara had been married twice before. "Welcome to Blackridge Hollow." The words were correct, but the warmth was entirely absent. "Thank you," Mara said evenly. "I appreciate your hospitality." "We'll need flour, coffee, sugar," Caleb said, pulling a list from his pocket. "Lamp oil, ammunition, and whatever vegetables you've got that haven't frozen." Mrs. Henderson moved to gather the items with obvious reluctance, her movements stiff and disapproving. While she worked, 2 more women entered the store, younger, perhaps in their 30s, both dressed in clothes that suggested they were ranchers' wives with aspirations toward respectability. They stopped short when they saw Mara, exchanging glances that communicated volumes. "Ladies," Caleb nodded to them. "Mr. Vance?" the taller of the 2 replied. Her eyes settled on Mara with unconcealed interest. "Is this your guest?" "My fiancée," Caleb corrected, his voice taking on an edge that Mara hadn't heard before. "Mara Ellison." "How lovely," the woman said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Sarah Pritchard. My husband owns the land adjacent to yours, and this is Margaret Colson." Mara nodded politely. "Pleased to meet you both." "You're from back east, I hear," Sarah continued, her tone light but probing. "Providence, wasn't it?" "That's right." "Must be quite a change, coming all the way out here. What brought you to our little town?" The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Mara heard the real inquiry beneath it. "What are you running from? What do you want? Why would a woman your age travel across the country to marry a man she's never met?" "Opportunity," Mara replied simply. "The East had nothing left to offer me." "And Caleb Vance did?" Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice sharp as broken glass. Before Mara could respond, Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between her and the 2 women. "That's enough." Sarah's eyebrows rose in mock innocence. "We're just being friendly, Mr. Vance. Surely your fiancée can handle a few questions." "She can handle anything you throw at her," Caleb said flatly. "But friendly questions don't usually come with knives attached. If you've got something to say it plain." The air in the store grew taut. Mrs. Henderson had stopped pretending to work and was watching the exchange with barely concealed interest. Sarah's smile faltered, and for a moment genuine anger flashed in her eyes. "We're just concerned," she said, recovering quickly. "A stranger coming to town, marrying one of our own so quickly. People talk, Mr. Vance. You know that. Let them talk. Doesn't make it true. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire, and where there's judgment, there's usually ignorance." Caleb's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute finality. "You've met her. You have no reason to think ill of her except that she's new and you're bored. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have supplies to collect." He turned back to the counter, dismissing them completely. The 2 women stood frozen for a moment, caught between indignation and uncertainty. Finally, Sarah gathered her composure and swept toward the door, Margaret following like a shadow. "Welcome to Blackridge Hollow, Miss Ellison," Sarah called over her shoulder, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm sure you'll find it enlightening." When they were gone, Mrs. Henderson finished packing the supplies in heavy silence. Caleb paid without comment, and they carried the goods out to the wagon. Only when they were loading the last sack did Mara speak. "That was ugly." "That was mild," Caleb replied. "It'll get worse. I'm not afraid of gossip." "Maybe you should be." He secured the load and turned to face her. "This town has broken stronger people than you." Mara felt a flash of anger, not at the town, but at the assumption that she was breakable. "You don't know how strong I am." "No," Caleb agreed, "but I'm starting to get an idea." They were about to climb back onto the wagon when a man approached from the direction of the saloon. He was perhaps 40, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors and the swagger of someone who thought that meant something. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled of whiskey even at 10 in the morning. "Vance," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "That your mail-order bride?" Caleb's expression didn't change, but Mara saw his jaw tighten. "Move along, Garrett. Just trying to be neighborly. Welcome the new arrival." Garrett, no relation to Thomas Garrett, the banker, Mara would learn later, leaned against the wagon wheel, studying Mara with obvious appreciation that made her skin crawl. "She's prettier than I expected. Must have cost you extra." "Last warning," Caleb said quietly. "Walk away." "Or what? You'll defend her honor." Garrett laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Everyone knows what kind of woman answers those advertisements. Desperate, used up, looking for any man foolish enough to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Caleb moved faster than Mara would have thought possible for a man his age, grabbing Garrett by the collar and slamming him against the wagon with enough force to rattle the boards. The transformation was instant and complete, the quiet, controlled rancher replaced by something considerably more dangerous. "You will apologize to the lady," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "Right now." Garrett's bravado evaporated like morning dew. Up close, with Caleb's hands twisted in his shirt and those pale eyes burning into him, he suddenly looked like what he was, a small man trying to feel big by tearing others down. I apologize, ma'am," he stammered. "Now get out of my sight," Caleb released him with a shove. "And if I hear you've spoken her name again, I'll finish this conversation in a way you won't enjoy." Garrett stumbled backward, caught himself, and fled toward the saloon without another word. Mara stood frozen, processing what had just happened. She'd been defended before, usually by herself, but never with such swift, controlled violence. Caleb had moved like a man who knew exactly how much force to apply and when to stop. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Caleb checked the wagon straps, his breathing steady despite what had just occurred. "Yes, I did. I've heard worse. Not while standing next to me, you haven't." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw genuine emotion in those pale eyes. Not anger anymore, but something fiercer and more protective. "You're going to be my wife. That means something. And one thing it means is that nobody speaks to you like that." Mara felt something shift in her chest. Not love. It was too early for that, and both of them were too practical. But recognition. The sense that maybe, just maybe, Caleb Vance was exactly the kind of man she'd spent her entire life hoping existed. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, then climbed onto the wagon. "Let's go home." The ride back was silent, but it was a different quality of silence than before. Mara found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, reassessing everything she thought she knew. He'd defended her, not with words or empty gestures, but with action. And he'd done it not because she needed defending, Mara could fight her own battles, but because he'd decided she was his responsibility, and he took his responsibilities seriously. When they arrived back at the ranch, Caleb unloaded the supplies while Mara started preparing the midday meal. They worked in their customary quiet efficiency, but the atmosphere had changed. Something unspoken had been established in town, a line drawn that both of them understood. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself with variations. Each trip to town brought new judgment, new whispers, new small cruelties disguised as concern or curiosity. The women were particularly brutal, their questions sharp as needles, designed to draw blood without leaving obvious wounds. They wanted to know about Mara's past, her intentions, whether she truly understood what frontier life demanded. They wondered aloud, in voices just loud enough for her to hear, whether a woman her age could handle the physical demands of ranch work, whether Caleb was making a terrible mistake, whether she'd even last through the first winter. The men were more direct. They made crude jokes about desperate women and lonely ranchers, about what kind of arrangement really existed between them. Some of it was said to Caleb's face, which usually resulted in swift and decisive corrections. More often, it was muttered behind his back, spread through the saloon and the blacksmith shop, and anywhere men gathered to feel bigger by making others smaller. But Mara didn't break. Every insult, every judgment, every whispered speculation rolled off her like water off oilcloth. She'd survived worse in the crowded tenements and factory towns back east. At least here, the cruelty came with space around it, room to breathe between confrontations. What surprised her was how the isolation affected Caleb. He'd lived in this town for more than 2 decades, had built his ranch from nothing, had earned the respect that came from hard work and honest dealing. But within days of announcing their engagement, that respect began to curdle into something uglier. Old friends became distant. Neighbors who'd once helped during difficult times suddenly had other obligations. Even Thomas Garrett, who'd first suggested the matrimonial arrangement, seemed uncomfortable when they encountered each other on the street. One evening, about 10 days before the wedding, Mara found Caleb on the porch, smoking his pipe and staring out at the darkening plains. She'd noticed he did this when something was bothering him, retreated into silence and distance. "They're getting to you," she said, sitting down beside him. "No." "Liar." He glanced at her, almost smiled. "Maybe a little. You've lived here a long time. Their opinion matters to you." "It shouldn't." He drew on the pipe, exhaled slowly. "I've never cared much what people thought. But this is different. Because it's about me? Because it's unfair." The words came out with surprising heat. "They don't know you. They've made up their minds based on nothing but prejudice and boredom, and there's not a damn thing I can do to change it." Mara was quiet for a moment, watching the last light drain from the sky. "You could call it off," she said finally. "The engagement. Send me back east. That would solve the problem." Caleb turned to look at her directly. "Is that what you want?" "I'm asking what you want. I want to know if you're having second thoughts." "I'm not," Mara said firmly. "But I won't trap you in an arrangement that costs you everything you've built here." He studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes searching. Then he shook his head. "This town doesn't own me. Never has. I stayed here because the land was good and the work was honest. But if the price of their approval is giving up the first real partnership I've had in 20 years, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then they can keep their approval." "You're sure?" "Are you?" Mara met his gaze steadily. "I've never been more sure of anything." Something passed between them in that moment, a commitment that went deeper than the practical arrangement they'd started with. They were choosing each other, consciously and deliberately, in full knowledge of what it would cost. "Then we're getting married," Caleb said, "and everyone else can go to hell." The next morning brought new trouble, though of a different kind. Mara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard Caleb curse, a rare occurrence that immediately drew her attention. She hurried outside to find him standing near the barn, staring at the ground with an expression of fury barely held in check. "What's wrong?" He pointed. Someone had cut through the fence during the night, deliberately and cleanly. The wire lay in neat coils on the frozen ground, and beyond the gap Mara could see disturbed earth where cattle had been driven through. "How many?" she asked. "Can't tell until I do a count, but enough." He knelt, examining the cut wire. This was deliberate. Wire doesn't cut itself this clean. Mara felt ice settle in her stomach. "The town?" "Someone from it." Caleb stood, his jaw set in a hard line. "They're escalating." They spent the rest of the morning riding the property lines, checking fences and counting cattle. By noon, they'd confirmed what Caleb suspected. 20 head missing, driven off through the cut fence and disappeared into the open range. For a ranch Caleb's size, it was a significant loss. More than that, it was a message. "We need to report this," Mara said as they rode back toward the house. "To who? Marshall Cooper?" Caleb's laugh was bitter. "He plays cards with half the men in this town every Saturday. You think he's going to investigate his drinking buddies? So we just accept it? We fix the fence, replace the cattle when we can, and we watch our backs." He reined in his horse, turning to face her. "This is what I was trying to warn you about. It's not just words anymore." Mara absorbed this, her mind working through the implications. "They're trying to break you, make it so expensive to keep me that you'll give up." "That's my guess." "And if you don't give up?" "Then it gets worse." She nodded slowly. "All right. Then we'd better be ready for worse." That afternoon, while Caleb repaired the fence, Mara rode into town alone. It was a calculated risk, but she'd learned long ago that sometimes the best defense was offense. She needed to understand exactly what they were up against, and that meant taking the town's temperature without Caleb there to shield her. The general store was busy when she arrived. Several women clustered around the counter, examining fabric and trading gossip. The conversation died the moment Mara walked in, replaced by hostile silence. "Mrs. Henderson," Mara said pleasantly, approaching the counter, "I need to place an order for fence supplies." "Fence supplies?" The older woman's eyebrows rose. Something happened out at the Vance place? Someone cut our fence last night, ran off about 20 head. The statement landed like a stone in still water. The women exchanged glances, some surprised, others carefully neutral. Mrs. Henderson's expression didn't change. "That's unfortunate," she said flatly. "Cattle theft is a serious crime." "Yes," Mara agreed. "It is. I imagine Marshal Cooper will be very interested in investigating." "I imagine he will." Mrs. Henderson began writing up the order, her movements mechanical. "Wire and posts? And anything else you'd recommend for securing a fence line against accidents?" The emphasis on the last word wasn't lost on anyone in the store. Mara saw Sarah Pritchard stiffen, saw Margaret Colson's eyes narrow. She was making it clear that she knew the fence cutting wasn't random, that she wasn't intimidated, and that she wasn't going anywhere. "I'll have the supplies ready by tomorrow," Mrs. Henderson said. "Thank you." Mara paid, then turned to address the other women directly. "Ladies, I wonder if I might have a word." The request caught them off guard. Sarah recovered first. "Of course." Mara took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I understand that my presence here is uncomfortable for some of you. I'm an outsider, and I'm marrying one of your own under circumstances that probably seem suspicious. I don't expect you to like me or trust me, but I do expect basic civility." "We've been perfectly civil," Sarah protested. "You've been polite," Mara corrected. "There's a difference. Politeness is saying the right words while thinking the worst things. Civility is giving someone a chance before you judge them." "And you think you deserve a chance?" Margaret's voice was cold. "I think everyone deserves a chance, but I'm not asking for one." Mara held their gazes one by one. "I'm telling you that I'm staying, that I'm marrying Caleb Vance in 8 days, and that whatever you throw at us, gossip, judgment, or something worse, we'll weather it together. So you can accept that reality, or you can keep fighting it, but the outcome won't change." The silence that followed was absolute. Mara had drawn a line as clear as the one Caleb had drawn with Garrett, but in a different way. She wasn't threatening or posturing, she was simply stating facts. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Ellison." "I've been called both," Mara replied, "usually on the same day." She left before anyone could respond, aware of the eyes burning into her back, but refusing to hurry or look uncertain. It was only when she was back on her horse, heading out of town, that she allowed herself to exhale fully. When she arrived back at the ranch, Caleb was finishing the fence repairs. He looked up when she dismounted, his expression questioning. "I went to town," Mara said, "ordered supplies and had a conversation with the ladies of Blackridge Hollow." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I made it clear we're not backing down." Caleb set down his tools and walked over to her. "That was dangerous." "So is pretending we're not in a fight." He considered this, then nodded slowly. "What did they say?" "Not much, but they heard me." Mara met his eyes. "Caleb, we need to talk about what happens if this gets worse. If it's not just cut fences and stolen cattle." "I know. Do you have a plan?" "Keep working. Keep our heads down. Wait for them to get bored." "And if they don't get bored?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then we make them understand that we're tougher than they are." Over the next week, the pressure intensified. More fences were cut, though no more cattle were stolen. Perhaps because Caleb and Mara began taking turns keeping watch at night. Supplies they'd ordered went mysteriously missing or arrived damaged. The banker, Thomas Garrett, called in a loan payment early, forcing Caleb to liquidate assets he'd planned to keep. But through it all, neither Mara nor Caleb wavered. They worked harder, slept less, and presented a united front that seemed to frustrate the town more than intimidate it. The wedding was 3 days away, and preparations continued despite everything. 2 nights before the ceremony, Mara was cleaning up after supper when Caleb spoke suddenly. "I want you to know something." She turned, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "All right. When I wrote that advertisement, I was looking for help, a partner, someone practical." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "But you've been more than that. You've been brave, stronger than you needed to be, and I want you to know that I see it, that I appreciate it." Mara felt warmth spread through her chest. Thank you. And I want you to know that whatever happens, with the town, with the ranch, with any of it, I'm with you. Not because we have an arrangement, but because, he trailed off, searching for the right words. Because we choose to be, Mara finished softly. Yes. She crossed the kitchen and, for the first time, took his hand deliberately. His palm was rough, calloused, but warm. I choose this too, Caleb. Every day, despite everything. He squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll be fine. We will. They stood like that for a moment, two people who'd started as strangers and become something neither quite had words for yet. Not love, perhaps, but something equally powerful. Partnership, respect, and the quiet certainty that together they could weather anything the world threw at them. The next morning brought Marshal Cooper to their door. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a badge that seemed to weigh him down and eyes that avoided direct contact. Morning, Vance, Miss Ellison. He shifted uncomfortably on the porch. Need to have a word with you both. Come in, Caleb said, though his tone suggested it wasn't really an invitation. Inside, the marshal accepted coffee, but didn't sit. I've been hearing reports, fence cutting, cattle theft. Some folks are saying you're causing trouble, trying to start something with the town. Some folks are lying, Caleb replied flatly. We're the ones being targeted. That's your side of it. It's the only side that matters because it's the truth. Cooper sighed. Look, Vance, I'm just trying to keep the peace. This wedding of yours has folks stirred up. Maybe if you postponed it, let things cool down. No. Caleb's voice was absolute. Be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm telling you that I'm marrying Mara Ellison in 2 days, that we've done nothing wrong, and that whoever's been cutting my fences and spreading lies is the one you should be investigating. The marshal's face reddened. You're making this very difficult. Good, Mara said quietly. Both men turned to look at her. Because someone needs to make it difficult for whoever's been terrorizing us. And if you won't do your job, Marshal, then we'll handle it ourselves. Cooper stared at her, clearly unused to being challenged by women. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise, Mara corrected. We have a right to protect our property and ourselves. If the law won't help us, we'll help ourselves. The marshal opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. You're both being fools. This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders making demands. Then maybe this town needs to learn, Caleb said. After Cooper left, Mara and Caleb stood at the window, watching him ride away. That didn't help, Mara observed. No, but I'm done pretending we can win them over with patience. Caleb turned to her. 2 more days. Think you can hold out? Can you? He smiled, a real smile, rare and genuine. With you? I think I can hold out forever. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday at 2 o'clock, and by Thursday morning, the entire town knew that Caleb Vance and Mara Ellison intended to go through with it despite everything. The tension had become almost physical, something you could feel in the air like the pressure before a storm breaks. Mara woke that Thursday to find frost coating the windows in delicate patterns, and Caleb already gone from the house. She dressed quickly, pulling on her work clothes and boots, and stepped outside to find him standing near the barn, staring down the road toward town. Something in his posture made her stomach tighten. What is it? She called, crossing the yard. He didn't answer immediately, just pointed. In the distance, a rider was approaching at a deliberate pace, not hurried, but purposeful. As the figure drew closer, Mara could make out details. A man, well-dressed in city clothes that looked absurdly out of place against the raw frontier landscape. He rode like someone unused to horses, gripping the reins too tight, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. You expecting someone? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. No. But even as she said it, something cold and familiar unfurled in Mara's chest. The way the man sat his horse, the angle of his shoulders, there was something she recognized even at a distance. The rider came closer, and Mara's breath caught. She knew that face. Those cold blue eyes, that thin mouth set in a line of perpetual disapproval. She knew the way he carried himself, like a man who'd never been told no and wouldn't accept it if he was. Mara, Caleb said quietly, reading the tension in her body. Who is that? My past, she whispered. Coming to collect. The man reined in his horse about 20 feet away, looking down at them with an expression of distaste, as if he'd stepped in something unpleasant. He was perhaps 50, well-fed and well-groomed, with the soft hands and calculating eyes of someone who made his living from other people's labor. Mara, he said, his voice smooth as oil and just as slippery. You're a difficult woman to find. That was intentional, William. Mara kept her voice steady, though her heart was hammering. What are you doing here? William Ketchum, her second husband's business partner, the man who'd made her last years in Providence a living nightmare, dismounted with awkward stiffness. He brushed dust from his coat with fastidious precision before answering. I've come to bring you home, of course, to settle your late husband's affairs properly. My late husband? Mara felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Daniel is dead? 3 months now. Consumption took him. William's eyes flickered to Caleb, assessing and dismissing him in the same glance, which means certain obligations fall to you as his widow. I left Daniel 2 years ago. Any obligations I had died when I walked out that door. I'm afraid the law disagrees. William withdrew a folded document from his coat. Daniel accumulated significant debts before his passing. As his legal widow, you're responsible for settling them. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Mara and William. She's told you she's not interested. Time for you to leave. William regarded him with the kind of amused contempt city men reserved for anyone they considered beneath them. And you are? Caleb Vance. This is my land you're standing on. Ah, the rancher. William's smile was unpleasant. Yes, I heard about your little arrangement. Mail-order bride, wasn't it? How very frontier. Watch your mouth, Caleb said quietly, but there was steel underneath the words. Or what? You'll challenge me to a duel? William laughed. This isn't some penny dreadful, Mr. Vance. This is reality. And the reality is that Mara has legal obligations back east. She can return willingly, or I can make things very unpleasant for both of you. Mara found her voice, stepping around Caleb to face William directly. I don't believe you. Daniel never mentioned business debts. He was a foreman, not a businessman. He became a businessman after you left. My partner, in fact. We had several ventures together. William's expression hardened. Ventures that failed spectacularly, leaving me holding obligations I cannot satisfy alone. The creditors are circling Mara. They want their money. And since Daniel is dead, they'll take it from his widow. She owes them nothing, Caleb said. Actually, she owes them nearly $3,000. William watched Mara's face go pale with satisfaction. A substantial sum, one that will require her to return to Providence, where we can arrange proper repayment through her labor or other means. The implication hung in the air like poison. Mara felt rage and fear warring inside her chest. She'd escaped this. Escaped William and his manipulations. Escaped the suffocating grip of a life that had nearly destroyed her. And now here he was, trying to drag her back into it. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said. Then I'll have the marshal arrest you for debt evasion. Is that what you want? To start your new life as a fugitive? The marshal here doesn't have jurisdiction over Eastern debts, Caleb pointed out. No, but I can wire the Providence authorities, have a proper warrant issued. It might take a few weeks, but... William shrugged. I'm a patient man, and I have resources. How long can you hold out, Mr. Vance? How long before the pressure becomes too much? Mara saw it then. The entire plan laid out like a chess game. William hadn't come to collect a debt. He'd come to destroy her chance at a new life because she'd had the audacity to escape his control. The money was just the weapon he was using. Get off my land, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a register that made William step backward involuntarily. Right now. I'll go, William agreed, remounting his horse with effort. But I'll be staying in town, at the Blackridge Hotel. And I'll be waiting, Mara. You have until Monday to come to your senses. After that, I make things official. He rode away, and Mara stood frozen, watching him disappear down the road. She felt Caleb's hand on her shoulder, solid and real, pulling her back from the edge of panic. Tell me, he said quietly. All of it. So she did. Standing there in the cold morning air, she told him about Daniel Ketchum, the factory foreman who'd seemed kind at first, who'd courted her properly and promised stability, about how the kindness had curdled into possessiveness, how his temper had grown darker after every drink, how the promises had turned to threats. About the night she'd finally fled with nothing but the clothes on her back, leaving everything behind because staying meant dying, either quickly at his hands or slowly from the crushing weight of being owned. And she told him about William, Daniel's cousin and business partner, who'd always watched her with calculating eyes, who'd made suggestions that weren't quite propositions but weren't quite innocent either, who'd blamed her for Daniel's downward spiral after she left, who'd written letters promising to find her and make her pay for the humiliation she'd caused the Ketchum family. "I thought I was far enough away," Mara finished, her voice rough. "I thought I could finally be free of them." Caleb was quiet for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he said, $3,000. That's what he claims you owe? Even if the debt is real, it's not mine. I wasn't involved in any business ventures. William is lying. Probably, but that doesn't mean he can't cause trouble. Caleb looked toward town, his jaw set. We need to see Thomas Garrett, get a legal perspective on this. They rode into Blackridge Hollow within the hour, drawing even more stares than usual. The news of William Ketchum's arrival had clearly spread, small towns being what they were, and speculation was running wild. Mara could practically hear the whispers. I knew there was something wrong with her. I knew she was running from something. Poor Caleb Vance, taken in by a woman with a past. Thomas Garrett's office was in the back of the bank, a small room lined with law books and smelling of pipe smoke. The banker looked up when they entered, his expression troubled. "Heard you had a visitor," he said without preamble. "William Ketchum, staying at the hotel, making quite an impression." "What's he been saying?" Caleb asked. "That Mara owes him money, that she's a runaway wife trying to escape her obligations, that you're being deceived." Thomas gestured to chairs. "Sit, tell me your side." Mara laid out the facts as clearly as she could. Her marriage to Daniel, her escape, the 2 years of silence before William's sudden appearance. She showed Thomas the matrimonial letters, proof that she'd been honest with Caleb from the start about her past. Thomas listened carefully, making notes. When she finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "First, the good news. Legally, you're not automatically responsible for a deceased husband's business debts unless you were a partner or co-signed on loans. If Daniel accumulated these debts after you left, you have a strong defense." "And the bad news?" Caleb asked. "The bad news is that proving it will take time and money. Ketchum can file suit, force you to appear in Providence, drag this out for months. And even if you win, the damage to your reputation here." Thomas trailed off meaningfully. "The town already thinks the worst of her," Caleb said flatly. "This just gives them an excuse to feel righteous about it." "Precisely." Thomas turned to Mara. "I'm not trying to frighten you, but you need to understand what you're facing. Ketchum is a businessman from back east. He has resources, connections, and apparently a vendetta. Fighting him legally could bankrupt you both and might not even succeed." "So what do you suggest?" Mara asked. "Honestly, the safest course would be to negotiate, offer a settlement, something less than the full amount, and get him to drop the claim." "Absolutely not." Mara's voice was sharp. "I won't give that man $1. This isn't about money. It's about control. He wants to prove he can still reach me, still hurt me. If I pay him, it never ends." Caleb nodded slowly. "She's right. Men like Ketchum, they don't stop until you make them stop." "Then you're choosing the hard road," Thomas warned, "and it's going to get harder before it gets better." They left the bank to find William Ketchum holding court in front of the general store, surrounded by a small crowd of townspeople. He was speaking in that smooth, educated voice, laying out his case for anyone who would listen. Simply trying to collect what's legally owed. "I understand you all feel protective of Mr. Vance. He's one of your own, but this woman, she's deceived him, hidden her true circumstances. I have documentation proving the debts, proving her marriage to my cousin. I'm merely asking that she honor her obligations." Sarah Pritchard was there, hanging on every word. "It's shameful," she said loudly, "coming here pretending to be respectable when all along she was running from her responsibilities." Mara felt Caleb tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. "Let me handle this." She stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. William turned, his expression shifting from false sympathy to cold calculation. "William," Mara said clearly, her voice carrying, "you want to talk about obligations? Let's talk about them. Daniel beat me. He came home drunk more nights than sober and took his failures out on my body. I have scars to prove it. The only thing I ran from was dying at his hands." A ripple went through the crowd. This was not the narrative William had been selling. "That's a serious accusation," William said smoothly, "one made conveniently after Daniel is no longer here to defend himself. I reported it twice to the Providence police. The records exist." Mara held his gaze. "And you knew. You saw the bruises. You watched it happen and said nothing because Daniel was family, and I was just some factory girl who should be grateful for the attention." William's face darkened. "You're making this worse for yourself." "No, I'm telling the truth, something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." She turned to address the crowd. "This man didn't ride all the way out here for $3,000. He came because I had the audacity to escape, because I chose myself over the Ketchum family's reputation, and he can't allow that to stand." "You think you're so clever," William said, his composure cracking. "But you're still just a desperate woman grasping at respectability. How long before you do to Vance what you did to Daniel? How long before—" "That's enough!" Caleb's voice cut through like a knife. He moved to stand beside Mara, his presence solid and unmovable. "You've made your case. Now hear mine. Mara Ellison is going to be my wife, day after tomorrow, in front of this entire town. And whatever lies you're selling, whatever claims you think you have, they end here." "You can't possibly be serious," William sputtered. "She's toxic. She'll destroy you." "Then that's my choice to make." Caleb's eyes swept the crowd. "And I'm making it. Anyone who has a problem with that knows where to find me."
Didn't it?
"Bam!" The crowd began to disperse, uncomfortable with the confrontation. But Mara noticed something. While many faces still held judgment, a few, very few, but more than before, showed something else. Uncertainty. The first crack in the wall of absolute condemnation. William remounted his horse, his face flushed with anger. "This isn't over." "Yes," Mara said quietly. "It is. You just haven't accepted it yet." He rode away, and Mara felt her legs start to shake with delayed reaction. Caleb steadied her, his hand firm on her elbow. "You did well," he said. "I made an enemy." "You already had an enemy. You just made him show his true face." Caleb guided her toward their wagon. "Let's go home." But home was where the next disaster was waiting. They saw the smoke from half a mile away, a thin column rising against the afternoon sky. Caleb urged the horses faster, and as they crested the hill that overlooked the ranch, Mara's heart sank. The barn was burning. Not fully engulfed, but enough. Flames licked at the eastern wall, fed by dry wood and old hay. Caleb drove the wagon recklessly close and jumped down before it fully stopped, racing toward the barn. Mara followed, her mind already working through what needed to be done. "The animals!" Caleb shouted, throwing open the barn doors. Smoke billowed out thick and choking. Together they worked frantically, leading horses out into the yard, driving cattle away from the structure. The smoke was dense, burning Mara's throat and eyes, but she pushed through it, guided by Caleb's shouts and her own desperate determination. It took 20 minutes of brutal effort, but they got every animal out alive. Only then did Caleb grab buckets and start fighting the fire itself. Mara joined him, hauling water from the well in a rhythm that quickly became automatic. Fill, run, throw, repeat. Her arms screamed, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. By the time they had the fire under control, the sun was setting and both of them were covered in soot and ash. The barn's eastern wall was mostly destroyed, the structure itself weakened but salvageable. If they'd arrived even 30 minutes later, the entire building would have been lost. Caleb stood in the yard, staring at the damage with an expression of cold fury. This was deliberate. Mara didn't need to ask how he knew. She could see it too, the way the fire had started in a corner away from any lamp or stove, the accelerated spread that suggested accelerant. "William?" she asked. "Maybe. Or someone in town taking his side." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that they're escalating. We should tell Marshal Cooper." And say what? That someone who left no evidence started a fire that could have been an accident? Caleb shook his head. Cooper won't help us. You saw how he was before. Mara looked at the damaged barn, at their exhausted animals milling in the yard, at Caleb's soot-streaked face. They were 2 days from their wedding, and their entire world was under siege. What do we do? She asked quietly. Caleb was silent for a long time, staring at the ruins. Then he straightened, and Mara saw something shift in his eyes, a decision made, a line crossed. We get married, he said, tomorrow instead of Saturday. We don't give them time to plan anything else. Tomorrow? First thing in the morning. The minister owes me a favor. He'll do it. Caleb turned to her. Unless you want to wait, if you want to reconsider any of this, no. Mara's answer was immediate and certain. Tomorrow is perfect. We marry, we make it legal, and then we deal with whatever comes next together. They spent what was left of the evening securing the animals and salvaging what they could from the barn. By the time they finished, it was full dark, and both were so exhausted they could barely stand. Inside the house, Mara heated water for washing while Caleb checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Neither spoke much. There was too much to say and too little energy to say it. Finally, clean and wearing fresh clothes, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd been through battle together and come out the other side. Your past came looking for you today, Caleb said finally. Mine never left. Mara looked at him questioningly. He took a breath, choosing words carefully. After Elizabeth died, I wasn't a good man for a while. Drank too much, fought too much, blamed the world for what I'd lost. The town forgave me eventually, mostly because I owned land and worked hard, but they never forgot. And now, with you here, with the wedding, I think some of them see it as proof that I never really belonged here in the first place. What changed you? Mara asked. What made you stop being that man? Waking up one morning in a jail cell, realizing I was destroying myself and it wouldn't bring her back. So I built walls instead. Worked until I couldn't think. Became so quiet, people forgot I could speak. He looked at her. You're the first person in 20 years who made me want to tear those walls down. Mara reached across the table and took his hand. I'm glad you did. Even with all this chaos? Especially with all this chaos. It means what we're building is real enough to threaten them. Caleb squeezed her hand gently. Tomorrow then. We marry, and we face whatever comes next. Together, Mara confirmed. They sat like that for a while longer, two people on the eve of a wedding that felt more like a declaration of war. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and the promise of more trouble to come. But inside, in the warm glow of lamplight, Mara and Caleb had found something neither had expected, an alliance that was becoming something deeper, built on honesty and hardship, and the simple, radical decision to stand together. Morning came cold and clear. Mara dressed in her best dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple dark blue that she'd brought from Providence. She pinned up her hair carefully, studying her reflection in the small mirror. 45 years old, marrying for the third time, about to become the wife of a man she'd known for less than a month. It should have felt reckless. Instead, it felt right. Caleb was waiting downstairs dressed in his one good suit, looking uncomfortable and handsome in equal measure. When he saw her, something flickered in his eyes. Not love, not yet, but appreciation, recognition. You look beautiful, he said quietly. You clean up well yourself. They rode into town in the wagon, neither speaking much. The minister, Reverend Holbrook, was a thin man in his 60s who'd known Caleb for years. He met them at the small church with a bemused expression. Caleb, when you said first thing this morning, I thought you were joking. I never joke about important things. Can you do it or not? Holbrook studied them both for a moment, then nodded. I can, but you'll need witnesses. I'll witness. Thomas Garrett stepped out from behind a pew, followed by his wife Eleanor. Heard about the fire last night. Figured you might be doing this. Mara felt a surge of gratitude. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Thomas said gruffly. Half the town thinks I'm crazy for supporting this. But I've known Caleb long enough to trust his judgment. If he says you're worth it, then you're worth it. The ceremony was brief and practical, much like the arrangement that had started it all. Reverend Holbrook spoke about partnership and commitment, about the challenges of frontier life and the importance of facing them together. Mara and Caleb repeated their vows in clear, steady voices, and when the minister pronounced them married, Caleb kissed her, a brief, almost formal kiss that nonetheless felt like sealing a pact. They signed the register with Thomas and Eleanor as witnesses, and just like that, Mara Ellison became Mara Vance. They were leaving the church when the commotion started. Shouts from the direction of the main street, the sound of running feet. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the gun at his hip as they emerged into the morning sunlight. Marshal Cooper was striding toward them, his face grim. Behind him, half the town seemed to be following, William Ketchum at the front of the crowd. "Vance," Cooper called, "need to talk to you." "About what?" "About the cattle that went missing last night from the Morrison Ranch. 20 head, driven off through a cut fence." Cooper's eyes were hard. "Same number and method as what happened to you, except Morrison's neighbor saw someone matching your description near the property line around sunset." Caleb went very still. "I was fighting a fire at my own barn last night, all evening." "Can anyone verify that?" "I can," Mara said immediately. "We were together the entire time." "Wife's testimony doesn't count," William Ketchum said smugly from the crowd, "especially a wife married in suspicious haste." Cooper looked uncomfortable. "I'm going to need you to come with me, Vance. Answer some questions." "This is absurd," Mara protested. "Someone cut our fence and stole our cattle. Then someone burned our barn, and now you're accusing Caleb of the same crimes?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm investigating." But Cooper's tone suggested he'd already made up his mind. Caleb met Mara's eyes, and she saw the calculation there, saw him weighing options, considering consequences. Finally, he nodded. "I'll come. But this is wrong, Cooper. You know it is." "What I know is that there's a pattern of trouble following you lately." The marshal gestured. "Let's go." As they led Caleb toward the marshal's office, Mara stood frozen in the street, still wearing her wedding dress, watching her husband of less than an hour being taken away like a criminal. William Ketchum stood nearby, not quite smiling, but radiating satisfaction. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring and speculating. Only Thomas and Eleanor remained with Mara. "This is a setup," Mara said, her voice shaking with fury. "They're framing him." "Probably," Thomas agreed, "but proving it is another matter." "Then we'll prove it." Mara turned to face them. "I need your help, both of you." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression fierce. "Tell us what you need." For the first time since arriving in Blackridge Hollow, Mara felt like she had true allies. "First, I need to know who actually owns the Morrison Ranch and who would benefit from making Caleb look guilty. Second, I need to find out where William Ketchum was last night. And third," she paused, steeling herself, "I need to make this town understand that I'm not going anywhere." Thomas nodded slowly. "Morrison's place is owned by a consortium of investors back east. Manager is a man named Dutch Hendricks. Been having financial trouble lately, rumor is. As for Ketchum," he frowned. "He was at the hotel bar most of the evening, but he left around 9, said he was retiring early." "That's after the barn fire started," Mara said. "What if he's the one who set it? What if this whole thing, the cattle theft, the accusations against Caleb, what if it's all William trying to destroy us?" "That's a serious accusation," Eleanor warned. "You'd need proof." "Then I'll find proof." Mara straightened her shoulders. "But first, I need to see my husband." Marshal Cooper wasn't inclined to let her into the office, but Thomas Garrett's presence and his status as the town banker smoothed the way. Mara found Caleb in a small back room, not quite a cell, but close enough. 10 minutes, Cooper said gruffly, closing the door behind her. Caleb stood when she entered, his expression tight with controlled anger. "This is going to get uglier." "I know." Mara moved closer. "But we're married now, legal and binding. That means something. It means you're tied to a man who might be facing criminal charges. It means we're partners, and partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult." She took his hands. Someone is orchestrating this, Caleb. Someone who wants to destroy both of us. And I have a pretty good idea who. She told him about William's movements, about the convenient timing of the Morrison cattle theft. Caleb listened, his expression growing darker. If it is Ketchum, he's being careful, covering his tracks. Then we'll have to be smarter. Mara squeezed his hands. Trust me? For the first time since the marshal had arrived, Caleb's expression softened slightly. With my life. Good, because I'm about to do something that will either prove our innocence or get us both run out of town. Mara, trust me, she repeated. Then she kissed him, quick and fierce, a promise sealed with urgency. When she left the marshal's office, the sun was high and the town was buzzing with speculation. Mara walked straight to the hotel where William was staying, her wedding dress drawing stares but her expression daring anyone to comment. The desk clerk tried to stop her, but Mara pushed past him and climbed the stairs to William's room. She knocked once, hard. Who is it? William's voice irritated. Your worst mistake, Mara called back. The door opened and William stood there in his shirt sleeves, looking genuinely surprised to see her. Mara, I heard about your husband's little legal troubles. How unfortunate. Cut the performance, William. I know it was you. I have no idea what you're talking about. The cattle theft, the accusation. You orchestrated it to frame Caleb. Mara stepped closer, lowering her voice. And I'm going to prove it. When I do, you won't just lose this game. You'll lose everything. William's expression hardened. You're grasping at straws. Vance is guilty, and soon everyone will know it. Your precious new life will fall apart, and you'll have no choice but to come back to Providence with me, where you belong. I belong nowhere that you are. Mara held his gaze. And I'm never coming back, not for you, not for anyone. She turned and walked away, feeling his eyes burning into her back. But she'd accomplished what she came for. She'd rattled him enough that he might make a mistake. The rest of that day was a blur of activity. Mara rode out to the Morrison ranch with Thomas, inspecting the cut fence and the tracks left by the stolen cattle. She talked to Dutch Hendricks, the ranch manager, noting his nervous demeanor and evasive answers. She gathered information, piece by piece, building a picture of what had really happened. By evening, she had enough to take back to Marshal Cooper. The marshal listened with obvious skepticism, but Mara laid out her case methodically. The timing of the thefts, William's presence in town and his vendetta against her, the convenient witness who supposedly saw Caleb near the Morrison property. All circumstantial, Cooper said when she finished. So is your case against Caleb? Mara shot back. But you were ready to believe it immediately. Why? Because it's easier than challenging someone with money and connections? Cooper's face reddened. Watch yourself, Mrs. Vance. Or what? You'll arrest me too. Mara leaned forward. I'm not afraid of you, Marshal, and I'm not afraid of this town. My husband is innocent, and I'll prove it even if I have to turn over every stone in Blackridge Hollow to do it. She left the office before he could respond, stepping out into the twilight. The street was mostly empty, but she could feel eyes watching from windows, hear whispers trailing in her wake. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The accusations against Caleb wouldn't disappear overnight, and William Ketchum was still out there, plotting his next move. But tonight, Mara allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction. She was married. She was fighting back. And for the first time in her entire life, she wasn't fighting alone. The night stretched long and cold as Mara sat alone in the ranch house, listening to the wind howl across the empty plains. Every creak of the floorboards made her reach for the rifle Caleb had taught her to use. Every distant sound sent her heart racing. But nothing came. No more fires, no more sabotage. Just silence and darkness, and the weight of being alone in a place that still didn't feel entirely like home. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, going over everything she knew, everything she'd learned. William Ketchum had the motive to destroy her new life. Dutch Hendricks, the Morrison ranch manager, had the opportunity and the financial desperation. And somewhere in the overlap of those two facts was the truth that would free Caleb. Dawn broke gray and uncertain. Mara fed the animals, checked the damaged barn, and made coffee strong enough to strip paint. She was standing on the porch, watching the sun struggle through heavy clouds when she saw riders approaching. 3 of them, moving at a deliberate pace. Her hand went to the rifle propped against the doorframe, but as they drew closer, she recognized Thomas Garrett in the lead. The other 2 were ranch hands she didn't know, both young and hard-looking in the way of men who worked brutal jobs for low pay. "Mrs. Vance," Thomas called, reining in his horse, "these men have something to tell you." The younger of the 2 hands, barely 20 with nervous eyes, spoke first. "Name's Billy Carson, ma'am. I worked for Dutch Hendricks at the Morrison place." "What happened?" Mara asked, stepping down from the porch. "Dutch let me go yesterday. Said he couldn't afford to keep me on." Billy twisted his hat in his hands. "But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I saw something 2 nights ago, the night your barn burned." Mara's pulse quickened. "What did you see?" "Man riding away from your property around sunset. Didn't think much of it at the time, figured it was a neighbor or something. But then yesterday, Dutch told me to say I'd seen Caleb Vance near our fence line that same evening. Said if I did, he'd give me my job back." "And did you?" Mara's voice was sharp. "No, ma'am. That's why he fired me." Billy met her eyes. "I don't know much, but I know lying. And I know Dutch has been desperate for money. Heard him talking to some fancy man from back east a few days ago. They were making plans, talking about how to handle the Vance problem." "William Ketchum," Mara breathed. "The fancy man was William Ketchum. Don't know his name, but he had city clothes and a way of talking like he thought he was better than everyone." The second ranch hand, older and weathered, spoke up. "I'm Pete Donnelly. I saw them too. Saw them meeting at the Morrison place 3 times over the past week. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't friendly." Thomas nodded grimly. "I brought them straight here. Figured you should hear this first." Mara's mind raced, fitting pieces together. "We need to take this to Marshal Cooper. Now." "There's more," Thomas said. "Eleanor did some digging last night. Found out that the Morrison Ranch is in serious financial trouble. The Eastern investors are threatening to foreclose unless Hendricks can turn a profit this season. But if a neighboring ranch, say Caleb's, were to fail, those cattle and land would go cheap at auction. Hendricks could expand, show the investors he's worth keeping on. And William gets to destroy my marriage in the process," Mara finished. 2 birds, 1 stone. They rode into town as a group, Mara on her horse flanked by Thomas and the 2 ranch hands. The morning streets were filling with people, and the sight of them together drew immediate attention. By the time they reached the marshal's office, a small crowd had gathered. Marshal Cooper was drinking coffee and looking hungover when they walked in. He glanced up, irritation flashing across his face when he saw Mara. "Mrs. Vance, I told you. These men have testimony that proves my husband's innocence," Mara cut him off. "You're going to listen to them, right now." Cooper's expression darkened, but Thomas stepped forward. "Marshal, this is official business. These witnesses have information about the Morrison cattle theft. I suggest you hear them out before this becomes a bigger problem than it already is." Grudgingly, Cooper gestured to chairs. Billy and Pete repeated their stories, this time with Mara and Thomas adding context about William Ketchum's presence in town, his vendetta against Mara, and the convenient timing of all the accusations against Caleb. When they finished, Cooper sat back, his face troubled. "This is serious, but it's still one man's word against another. Hendricks will deny it, and without proof, then get proof," Mara said fiercely. "Bring in William Ketchum, question him under oath, search Hendricks's office. Do your job instead of looking for the easy answer. Watch your tone. No." Mara stood, planting her hands on Cooper's desk. "I'm done watching my tone. I'm done being polite while this town tears my husband apart based on lies. You want to arrest someone? Arrest Dutch Hendricks for conspiracy and fraud. Arrest William Ketchum for arson and sabotage. But if you keep my innocent husband in that cell 1 more hour, I'll go to the territorial governor myself and explain how the marshal of Blackridge Hollow takes bribes to frame honest ranchers." The room went dead silent. Cooper's face turned deep red. "That's slander." "Is it?" Mara's voice was deadly calm. "Because Eleanor Garrett's been asking around. Found out you've been playing cards with Dutch Hendricks every week for months. Found out he's been losing badly, running up debts to you. How convenient that you'd be willing to help him eliminate his competition. Cooper stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. Get out of my office. Release my husband first. They stared at each other across the desk, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Thomas spoke quietly. Cooper, you know this is wrong. You know Caleb Vance isn't the kind of man to steal cattle or lie about it. And if you don't do the right thing here, I'll make sure every person in this territory knows why. He paused, including the territorial judge who's due here next month. The threat hung in the air. Cooper looked from Thomas to Mara to the two ranch hands, calculating odds and consequences. Finally, he swore under his breath and grabbed his keys. Fine. But if this blows up in my face, I'm holding all of you responsible. Caleb emerged from the back room looking tired and angry, but when he saw Mara, his expression softened fractionally. She went to him immediately, and for a moment they just stood there, her hand in his, communicating everything words couldn't capture. Thank you, Caleb said to Thomas and the ranch hands. Then to Mara, how did you— I told you to trust me, she said simply. They walked out of the marshal's office together into midday sunshine that felt brighter than it had any right to. The crowd outside had grown larger, word having spread that something significant was happening. Mara saw Sarah Pritchard and Margaret Colson among them, saw William Ketchum standing near the hotel entrance, his expression calculating. Caleb stopped in the middle of the street, surveying the gathered townspeople. When he spoke, his voice carried with authority. I know what you all think of me right now, what you think of my wife. But here's the truth. Someone in this town has been trying to destroy us since the day Mara arrived. Cutting fences, stealing cattle, burning barns, making false accusations. Not because we did anything wrong, but because we dared to build something together. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've lived here 23 years, worked this land, paid my debts, helped my neighbors when they needed it, and most of you respected that. But now, because I married a woman from out of town, a woman who's worked harder in 3 weeks than some of you have in 3 months, suddenly, I'm the enemy. We were just concerned, Sarah started, but Caleb cut her off. No, you were judging. There's a difference. His eyes swept the crowd. Mara came here honestly, told me her past, her circumstances, everything. We made an arrangement based on truth and hard work. Nothing shameful in that. Nothing wrong. William Ketchum stepped forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Mr. Vance, I understand you're loyal to your bride, but the fact remains that she has obligations. The fact remains, Mara interrupted, moving to stand beside Caleb, that you're a liar and a criminal. You came here claiming I owed debts, but you never showed proof. You spread rumors and turned this town against us. And when that wasn't enough, you conspired with Dutch Hendricks to frame my husband for crimes you either committed yourself or paid someone else to commit. The crowd rippled with shocked whispers. William's face went pale, then red. That's absurd. I have witnesses. So do we, Thomas Garrett said, stepping forward with Billy and Pete flanking him. Multiple witnesses who saw you meeting with Hendricks, planning exactly this kind of sabotage. Witnesses who were asked to lie about Caleb's whereabouts. William looked trapped, his eyes darting from face to face. You can't prove anything. Maybe not yet, Caleb said quietly. But the territorial judge will be very interested in hearing the evidence. Wire fraud, conspiracy, arson, those are serious charges, Ketchum, the kind that get Eastern businessmen locked up regardless of their connections. I came here to collect a legitimate debt. Show us the documentation, Mara demanded. Right now. Prove these debts exist. Prove I'm legally responsible for them. Prove anything you've said is true. William opened his mouth, closed it. His hand went to his coat pocket, then stopped. The silence stretched. That's what I thought, Mara said. There are no debts. There never were. You came here to punish me for leaving, and when you couldn't intimidate me into coming back, you decided to destroy the life I was building. But you failed, William. You failed because you underestimated both of us. Marshal Cooper, who'd been watching from his office doorway, stepped forward reluctantly. Mr. Ketchum, I think we need to have a conversation, official-like. William's composure finally cracked. I want a lawyer. Then you'll get one. In the meantime, you're not leaving town. Cooper gestured to his deputy. Make sure Mr. Ketchum stays at the hotel, under supervision. As the deputy escorted William away, the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Mara could hear the shift in tone, still skeptical, still uncertain, but no longer uniformly hostile. Doubt had been planted. Sarah Pritchard stepped forward, her expression troubled. Mrs. Vance, we didn't know. You thought the worst because it was easier than thinking at all, Mara said, not unkindly, but without forgiveness either. You judged me based on gossip and assumption, and you nearly destroyed an innocent man in the process. We were trying to protect Caleb. From what? From a partner who's worked beside him every day? From a woman who's fought harder for this ranch than most of you fight for anything? Mara shook her head. If you wanted to protect him, you should have trusted his judgment. Margaret Colson spoke up, her voice defensive. You have to understand, we've seen men taken advantage of before. Lonely ranchers courted by women who just want security. I worked in factories for 12 years, Mara cut her off. I survived 2 bad marriages and more hardship than you can imagine. I didn't need to marry Caleb for security. I could have survived on my own. I married him because we're better together than apart, because we chose each other freely, with full knowledge of what we were getting into. And if you can't understand that kind of partnership, then I pity you. Eleanor Garrett moved through the crowd to stand beside Mara, a visible show of support. I think what Mara's trying to say is that this town owes her and Caleb an apology, a real one, not just words. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Reverend Holbrook stepped forward. He'd been silent until now, watching everything unfold with his measured, careful gaze. Mrs. Vance is right, he said quietly. We did judge her unfairly. We let fear and prejudice cloud our judgment, and we nearly destroyed something good in the process. He turned to address the crowd. I married them yesterday morning because I saw something in them that reminded me why marriage matters. Not romance or passion, though those have their place, but partnership. 2 people committed to facing life together, whatever it brings. That's what they have. And we nearly destroyed it because we couldn't see past our own narrow thinking. One by one, faces in the crowd began to soften. Not all of them. Some remained hard and skeptical, too invested in their judgment to let it go. But enough. Enough that Mara could see a path forward. Thomas cleared his throat. There's still the matter of the Morrison Ranch. Dutch Hendricks needs to answer questions too. I'll handle that, Cooper said, looking uncomfortable but resigned. And I'll send word to the territorial authorities about Ketchum's activities. As the crowd began to disperse, Mara felt Caleb's hand find hers. They stood together in the street, battered but unbroken, watching their neighbors scatter back to their daily lives. You were magnificent, Caleb said quietly. I was angry. That too. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Thank you for fighting for us. That's what partners do, Mara replied. Then louder, so the remaining townspeople could hear, that's what husbands and wives do. They stand together. They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before. The weight of accusation had lifted, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of a battle won. Not the war. Mara knew the town's full acceptance would take time, if it ever came at all, but this battle, at least, was theirs. The damaged barn greeted them like a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But instead of despair, Mara felt determination settle in her bones. They would rebuild. They would continue. And they would do it together. Over the next 3 days, the truth emerged in pieces. Dutch Hendricks, faced with Billy and Pete's testimony and the threat of prosecution, confessed to conspiring with William Ketchum. William had approached him with a simple proposal: help destroy Caleb Vance's reputation and ranch. And in return, William would use his eastern connections to secure better terms with the Morrison Ranch investors. Hendricks, desperate and drowning in debt, had agreed. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Steal Caleb's cattle first, establishing a pattern, then steal the Morrison cattle and frame Caleb for it. With Caleb discredited and possibly imprisoned, his ranch would fail. Mara would be forced to return east with William, and Hendricks could buy Caleb's land cheap at auction, expanding his operation enough to satisfy his investors. The barn fire had been William's addition, a way to increase pressure when the cattle thefts alone hadn't broken them. He'd paid a drifter to set it, someone passing through who wouldn't be connected to him. Marshal Cooper, to his credit, arrested Hendricks and secured enough evidence to charge William with conspiracy, arson, and fraud. William's lawyer arrived from Providence 3 days later, full of bluster and threats, but the evidence was overwhelming. The territorial judge, when he arrived the following week, took one look at the case and ordered William held for trial. But more than the legal victories, what surprised Mara was the town's slow shift. Not everyone changed their minds. Sarah Pritchard remained coolly polite but distant, and several other families made it clear they still disapproved. But others, like Eleanor Garrett and Reverend Holbrook, became genuine allies. A few neighboring ranchers even stopped by to offer help rebuilding the barn, gruff apologies hidden in offers of spare lumber and extra hands. 1 week after Caleb's release, Mara was working in the garden she'd started behind the house when she heard a wagon approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and saw a woman she didn't recognize climbing down. The woman was perhaps 60, weathered and strong-looking, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore practical clothes and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd worked land her entire life. "Mrs. Vance?" the woman called. "Yes?" "I'm Martha Chen, own a ranch about 15 miles north of here." She extended a calloused hand and Mara shook it. "Heard about what happened with you and your husband. Wanted to come by, offer my respects." "That's kind of you?" Mara said, surprised. Martha smiled grimly. "Kind's got nothing to do with it. I came here 30 years ago as a mail-order bride myself. Married a rancher who needed help. Built a life from nothing. And I remember how this town treated me. Like I was something dirty, something shameful. Like I'd tricked my husband into marrying me instead of what it really was. Two people making a practical arrangement that turned into something real." Mara felt understanding dawn. "You know exactly what we're going through. Every step of it. And I wanted you to know that it gets better, not quickly and not all the way. Some folks will never accept you, but others will, eventually. And the ones who don't? Well, their opinion stops mattering after a while." They talked for an hour, Martha sharing stories of her early years in Blackridge Hollow, the challenges she'd faced, the small victories that had eventually added up to acceptance. When she left, she pressed a cloth bundle into Mara's hands. "Seeds," she said, "for your garden. Herbs, mostly, some vegetables. Things that grow well in this climate. Consider it a welcome gift, one practical woman to another." Mara watched her ride away, feeling something warm settle in her chest. She wasn't alone. There were others who'd walked this path before her, who understood the unique challenges of building a life on the frontier as an outsider, as a woman who dared to choose her own fate. That evening, she told Caleb about Martha's visit while they worked together repairing fence posts. "Martha Chen's tough as they come," Caleb said, driving a post into hard ground. "Lost her husband 5 years ago, runs that ranch herself now. If she's taking your side, that means something." "It means there's hope," Mara said. Caleb paused, leaning on the post driver. "You know, when I first wrote that advertisement, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting. A helper, someone practical, a warm body to keep the house from feeling so empty. And now?" He looked at her directly, his pale eyes intense. "Now I realize I got something I didn't even know I needed. A partner who fights, someone who doesn't fold when things get hard, someone who—" He trailed off, searching for words. "Someone who matches you," Mara finished softly. "Yes." He set down the post driver and moved closer. "I never expected that. Never thought I'd find it again after Elizabeth. But here you are." Mara felt emotion tighten her throat. "Here I am, still causing trouble, apparently. The best kind of trouble." Caleb reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with surprising gentleness. "The kind that makes life worth living." They stood like that for a moment, the setting sun painting the plains in shades of gold and amber. Then Caleb kissed her, and this time it wasn't formal or perfunctory. It was real, a promise of something growing between them that neither had planned for, but both were learning to embrace. When they pulled apart, Mara smiled. "We should finish this fence before dark." "Probably." But Caleb made no move to pick up his tools. "Or we could go inside, have an actual meal together without discussing sabotage or legal troubles." That sounds wonderful. They walked back to the house hand in hand, leaving the fence for tomorrow. Inside, Mara prepared dinner while Caleb laid a fire against the evening chill. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about ordinary things, the garden, the cattle, plans for spring planting. Normal conversation, the kind married couples everywhere had every day. But for Mara, it felt extraordinary. This was what she'd crossed the country for, what she'd fought so hard to build. Not romance or rescue, but this. Partnership, respect, and the simple comfort of sharing space with someone who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made you grateful for walls and warmth and companionship. William's trial is set for next month, Caleb said eventually. You'll have to testify. I know. It might bring up difficult things. Your time with Daniel, everything you went through. Mara was quiet for a moment, considering. I'm not afraid of my past anymore. It happened. It shaped me. But it doesn't own me. She looked at him. Coming here, marrying you, that was me taking ownership of my own story. Whatever William tries to do at that trial, he can't take that away. Caleb nodded slowly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. I've had to be, but it's easier now. Having someone beside me instead of behind me or ahead of me, just beside me. That makes all the difference. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the vast prairie sky fill with stars. Somewhere out there, Mara knew, there were still people who disapproved of their marriage, who whispered about the scandal of it all. But here, on this porch, with Caleb's solid presence beside her and a future stretching out like the endless plains, none of that seemed to matter. They'd fought for this, earned it through honesty and hard work and the simple refusal to let others define what their partnership could be. And in winning that fight, they'd found something neither had expected, not just survival, but the possibility of something deeper. Not love yet. Both were too practical to rush toward declarations they weren't ready to make, but something that could grow into love, given time and care and the daily choice to keep choosing each other. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. Caleb stood, offering his hand. Come inside, he said. It's getting cold. Mara took his hand and let him pull her up. Together they walked into the warm glow of their home, closing the door on the darkness and the judgment and all the battles they'd already won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. William's trial, the town's continued skepticism, the endless work of running a frontier ranch. But tonight, Mara Vance allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Contentment. The bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She had fought for this life, this partnership, this chance at building something real. And she had won. Not completely, not finally, but enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to keep building. Enough to believe that the future they were creating together was worth every battle they'd fought to claim it. Winter settled over Blackridge Hollow with a vengeance, bringing snow that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Mara woke each morning to find frost patterns on the windows, and Caleb already up, breaking ice in the water troughs and checking on the cattle. The work was relentless, but they fell into a rhythm, two people moving in practiced coordination, each anticipating what the other needed before words became necessary. The trial was scheduled for the third week of February, giving them nearly 6 weeks of relative peace. Peace punctuated by hard work and harder weather, but peace nonetheless. The town's attitude had shifted, not transformed, but softened around the edges. When Mara went to the general store, Mrs. Henderson's politeness now carried less frost. When they attended Sunday service, fewer people turned away. But real acceptance came slowly, earned in increments so small they were almost invisible day to day. One afternoon in late January, Mara was in the barn mucking stalls when she heard voices outside. She straightened, pitchfork in hand, and saw Eleanor Garrett climbing down from a wagon accompanied by 2 other women. One was Martha Chen, who'd become a regular visitor. The other was a stranger, younger, perhaps 35, with a kind face and nervous hands. "Mara," Eleanor called. "Have a minute?" Mara set down the pitchfork and walked out into the weak winter sunlight. "Of course. What brings you all out here?" "This is Rebecca Morrison," Eleanor said, gesturing to the younger woman. "Dutch Hendricks's sister-in-law. She has something to say to you." Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. Mrs. Vance, I need to apologize for my brother-in-law's actions, for not speaking up sooner when I knew something wasn't right. Mara studied her carefully. You knew what Dutch was planning? Not all of it, but I knew he was desperate, knew he'd been meeting with that man from back east. I heard them talking about you and your husband, about making trouble. Rebecca's voice broke slightly. I should have said something, should have warned you, but Dutch is family, and I was afraid if I spoke up, he'd lose the ranch, and my sister would have nothing. And now? Mara asked quietly. Now he's going to prison, and my sister has nothing anyway, and two innocent people nearly lost everything because I kept quiet. Rebecca met Mara's eyes. I can't undo what I didn't do, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry. And if there's anything I can do to make it right, I will. Mara absorbed this, feeling the familiar weight of anger and the newer, less comfortable weight of understanding. Rebecca had been caught between impossible choices, family loyalty and moral obligation. Mara knew that terrain intimately. Can you testify at the trial? She asked finally. Tell what you heard? What you knew? Rebecca nodded. I've already told Marshal Cooper I would. The prosecutor has my statement. Then you've already done what matters most. Mara paused, then extended her hand. Thank you for coming. Rebecca shook her hand, relief flooding her face. As the women prepared to leave, Martha lingered behind. You handled that well, she said. I'm tired of being angry, Mara admitted. It takes too much energy. Martha smiled. That's wisdom talking. Keep that close. You'll need it at the trial. The trial itself arrived with the first hints of spring. Snow still on the ground but melting in patches, the air carrying promises of warmth to come. The territorial judge, a severe man named Harrison Blake, set up court in Blackridge Hollow's largest building, the town hall. For 3 days, the entire town seemed to hold its breath as witnesses testified and lawyers argued, and the machinery of frontier justice ground forward. Mara testified on the second day. William's lawyer, a slick man from Providence named Aldridge, tried to paint her as an opportunist who'd seduced Caleb into marriage and then invented accusations when her past caught up with her. But Mara had been through worse interrogations in her life. She answered every question with calm precision, never raising her voice, never letting emotion cloud her testimony. When Aldridge suggested she'd married Caleb only for financial security, Mara looked him dead in the eye and said, I married Caleb Vance because he's an honest man who offered me honest partnership. If I'd wanted financial security, Mr. Aldridge, I would have stayed in Providence and married any of the dozen men who propositioned me over the years. I came west because I wanted to build something real with someone who valued hard work over pretty words, and that's exactly what I found. The courtroom rippled with murmurs. Judge Blake banged his gavel for silence, but Mara saw approval flicker in his eyes. Caleb testified next, his account matching Mara's in every detail. He spoke plainly about the harassment they'd endured, the sabotage, the false accusations. And when Aldridge tried to suggest that Caleb had fabricated the entire story to avoid accountability for actual cattle theft, Caleb's response was devastating in its simplicity. I've lived in this territory for 23 years, built my ranch from nothing, helped my neighbors, paid my debts, never once been accused of dishonesty until a stranger from back east decided I was in his way. Caleb's pale eyes fixed on William with unwavering intensity. You can believe his lies if you want, but everyone who actually knows me knows the truth. Billy Carson and Pete Donnelly testified about what they'd seen and heard, their accounts corroborated by Rebecca Morrison's tearful admission of what her brother-in-law had confessed to her. Thomas Garrett provided evidence of the meetings between William and Dutch Hendricks, financial records showing unusual payments that coincided with the sabotage events. By the third day, the case was effectively over. Judge Blake deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning his verdict, guilty on all counts. William Ketchum was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for conspiracy, fraud, and arson. Dutch Hendricks, who'd already pleaded guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence, received 3 years. When the verdict was read, Mara felt something release in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. It was over. Not just the trial, but the threat William had represented. Her past, which had haunted her across 300 miles and threatened to destroy her future, had finally been put to rest. Outside the courtroom, in the pale February sunshine, Caleb took her hand. "How do you feel?" he asked. Mara considered the question. "Free," she said finally. "For the first time in my entire life, I feel free." That evening, Thomas and Eleanor hosted a small gathering at their home. Nothing formal, just a few people who'd stood by Mara and Caleb through the worst of it. Martha Chen was there, along with Reverend Holbrook and his wife, Billy Carson, and Pete Donnelly, and Rebecca Morrison with her sister. It wasn't a celebration exactly. Too much had been damaged, too many hard feelings remained in the larger community. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that something important had been defended and won. "To partnership," Thomas said, raising his glass, "and to people brave enough to fight for what they believe in." They drank, and Mara felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, warm and solid and real. Spring came slowly that year, but when it arrived, it transformed everything. The snow melted, revealing earth ready for planting. Caleb and Mara worked from dawn to dusk, repairing the damage from William's sabotage, rebuilding what had been destroyed, preparing for calving season. The barn they rebuilt together, with help from a few neighboring ranchers who'd quietly decided that maybe the Vances deserved a chance after all. It was hard work, brutal, exhausting work that left them both aching and filthy every evening, but there was satisfaction in it, in watching something rise from ruins through their combined effort. One afternoon in late April, they were working on the barn roof when Mara heard a wagon approaching. She shaded her eyes and saw Sarah Pritchard driving, Margaret Colson beside her. For a moment, old tension tightened Mara's shoulders, but Sarah's expression, when she climbed down, wasn't hostile, just uncertain. "Mrs. Vance?" Sarah called up. "Could we have a word?" Mara and Caleb climbed down. Up close, Mara could see that both women looked uncomfortable, their usual confidence replaced by something that might have been shame. "We owe you an apology," Sarah said without preamble. "A real one, not the hollow things we've been saying. We judged you unfairly. We spread gossip that nearly destroyed you both. And we were wrong." Margaret nodded. "The trial made it clear. You were telling the truth about everything, and we refused to listen because—" She trailed off, searching for words. "Because it was easier to believe the worst," Mara finished for her. "I understand that impulse. We all do it. Look for simple explanations that confirm what we already think." "That doesn't excuse it," Sarah said. "We should have been better. Should have given you a chance before we condemned you." Mara looked at Caleb, who gave a slight nod. The decision was hers. She turned back to the two women. "I appreciate the apology, truly. But words are easy. If you mean it, prove it through actions. Treat us with the respect you'd show anyone else. Stop the whispers when we walk by. Give us the same courtesy you'd give your actual neighbors." Sarah extended her hand. "We can do that." Mara shook it, feeling the warmth of genuine contrition in the other woman's grip. It wasn't friendship, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was a start. Over the next months, more small reconciliations occurred. The town didn't transform overnight into a welcoming paradise, but the active hostility faded, replaced by wary acceptance and occasionally grudging respect. When Mara's garden came in strong and healthy, she shared the surplus with neighbors. When a fever swept through town that summer, she nursed sick children alongside their mothers, earning gratitude that slowly eroded prejudice. Caleb's reputation, damaged by the accusations, was restored through the same means it had been built originally: hard work, honest dealing, and time. The ranch prospered. The rebuilt barn stood solid. The cattle multiplied. Life, in its relentless forward motion, began to feel normal. But the real transformation happened more quietly, in the space between Mara and Caleb themselves. One evening in late summer, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set, a habit they'd developed, this quiet end-of-day ritual. Caleb was smoking his pipe, Mara was shelling peas, and the companionable silence between them felt as natural as breathing. "I've been thinking," Caleb said suddenly. "Dangerous occupation," Mara replied, smiling, "about what this is, what we've become." He set down his pipe, turning to face her. "We started as a practical arrangement, two people who needed something from each other. But that's not what this is anymore. Mara's hand stilled. No? No. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. Somewhere between fighting off saboteurs and rebuilding barns and facing down this town's judgment, we became something else. Partners, yes, but more than that. What would you call it? Mara asked softly. Caleb was quiet for a moment, searching for words that had never come easily to him. Love, I suppose. Not the wild, passionate kind from songs and stories, but something deeper. The kind built on trust and respect and choosing each other every single day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, but the kind that came from unexpected joy. I love you too, she said. I don't know when it happened exactly. Somewhere between your defending me in town and my defending you in court. Somewhere in all the work and worry and small kindnesses. But it's real. Caleb pulled her close, and they sat like that as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. Two people who'd come together out of desperation and practicality, who'd found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. We should expand the house, Caleb said after a while. Add on. Make it bigger. Mara pulled back to look at him. Why? Because this is our home now. Really ours. Not just mine. Not just a place you're staying, ours. And it should reflect that. They spent that winter planning the addition, a proper sitting room, a larger kitchen, another bedroom for guests, or perhaps someday other purposes neither wanted to name too explicitly. They were past the age for children, but the possibility hung in the air like a fragile hope. The work began the following spring, with Caleb and Mara doing most of it themselves, but accepting help from neighbors when it was offered. The community, which had once watched their every move with suspicion, now participated in their building project with something approaching genuine goodwill. 2 years after Mara first arrived in Blackridge Hollow, the expansion was complete. They held a small gathering to celebrate. Not a party exactly, but a casual afternoon where neighbors could see the work and offer congratulations. Martha Chen brought bread she'd baked. Eleanor Garrett brought preserves. Even Sarah Pritchard and Margaret Colson came, bringing fabric for new curtains. Standing in the new sitting room, surrounded by people who'd gone from enemies to neutral parties to something approaching friends, Mara felt the full weight of what they'd accomplished. Not just the physical building, but the life they'd constructed against all odds. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Mara found Caleb in their bedroom, no longer separate rooms, but a shared space, a shared life. Happy? He asked. More than I ever thought possible, she replied honestly. When I got on that train east, I was running, desperate. I didn't expect to find happiness, just survival, maybe. A place to breathe. And now? Now I have a home, a partner, a life I helped build with my own hands. She moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out over their land. I have you. Caleb wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. I'm the lucky one. I was half dead when you arrived, just going through motions. You brought me back to life. We brought each other back, Mara corrected. That's what partners do. The years that followed weren't easy. Frontier life never was. There were droughts that tested them, harsh winters that pushed their endurance, market fluctuations that threatened their financial stability. But they faced everything together, their partnership deepening with each challenge overcome. 5 years after their marriage, Martha Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep. Mara organized the funeral and discovered, to her surprise, that she'd been named in Martha's will. The older woman had left her a substantial portion of land adjacent to the Vance Ranch, along with a letter. You reminded me of myself, the letter read in Martha's shaky handwriting, a woman who refused to let this world break her, who built something real from nothing but determination and honest work. Take care of this land. It's yours now, earned through the same grit that earned mine. And remember, we're tougher than we look, us practical women. We survive. Mara wept reading those words, mourning a friend but also celebrating the legacy of strength passed from one generation to the next. The expanded ranch prospered. Caleb and Mara became fixtures in the community, respected, if not universally beloved. They attended town meetings, helped neighbors in crisis, contributed to the church building fund even though neither was particularly religious. They built a life that mattered not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real. 10 years after Mara's arrival, they sat on that same porch on a warm summer evening, both graying now but still strong, still working side by side every day. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Answering that advertisement? Coming all this way?" Mara looked at him, at the man who'd been a stranger, then a partner, then the great love of her life. At the ranch they'd built together, the land stretching out before them in endless possibility. "Never," she said. "Not for a single moment." "Even with all the hardship, the judgment, the sabotage, everything we went through?" "Especially because of that." Mara took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Easy things don't mean anything, but what we built, we earned every inch of it. Nobody can take that away." Caleb smiled, that rare, genuine smile she'd learned to treasure. "No, they can't." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. A coyote called, lonely and wild. The wind carried the scent of sage and earth and possibility. Mara thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived, desperate, frightened, running from a past that had nearly destroyed her. She thought about Caleb, carved from silence and grief, barely alive behind walls so high they'd seemed impenetrable. And she thought about who they'd become together. Two people who'd taken a practical arrangement and transformed it into something extraordinary through nothing more complicated than honesty, hard work, and the daily choice to keep choosing each other. "Thank you," Mara said quietly. "For what?" "For answering my letter, for giving me a chance, for standing beside me when the whole world seemed against us." Caleb squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being brave enough to take the risk, for fighting when most people would have given up, for making my life worth living again." They stayed on the porch until full dark, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast frontier sky. Inside, their home waited, warm and solid, built by their own hands, filled with the accumulated evidence of a life well lived. Outside, the land stretched endlessly, full of challenges and promise in equal measure. But here, on this porch, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. Two people who'd built something real from nothing but determination and trust. Two people who'd proven that love didn't have to start with passion to end in devotion. Mara Vance and Caleb Vance. Partners. Husband and wife. Two souls who'd been carved by hardship and refined by choice into something stronger together than either could have been alone. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of rain. Caleb stood, offering his hand. "Come inside," he said. "Storm's coming." Mara took his hand and let him pull her up. Together they walked into their home, closing the door on the darkness and the wind and the vast, indifferent prairie. But they were not indifferent. They had built this, earned it. And whatever storms came, literal or metaphorical, they would face them the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, with the quiet strength of two people who'd found exactly what they needed in each other. Not rescue, not romance, not the easy path. But something better, partnership forged in fire, tested by hardship, and proven unbreakable by time. And that, Mara thought, as Caleb wrapped his arms around her in the warm glow of lamplight, was worth every mile she'd traveled, every battle she'd fought, every moment of doubt and fear and desperate hope. She was home, finally, truly home, and she would never leave.